Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the Bolivar House here at the Center for Latin American Studies. We are happy to see you all, for those in person and now streaming online on YouTube. I'm absolutely thrilled, excited, and honored to have Professor Alejandro Madrazo here with us to give the seminar and the lecture titled Popular Sovereignty, the Rule of Law, How Mexico's Incipient Rule of Law Caved Under the Inertia of Narrative. So we give welcome for Alejandro Madrazo. We'll have Mirka, who will read Alejandro's semblance. So please, Mirka.
Everyone, I have the honor of introducing Mr. Alejandro Madrazo. He holds a master's degree in law and a J.S.D. from the Yale Law School. In 2022, Professor Madrazo was a tenured professor at CIDE in Aguascalientes, Mexico, where he founded the interdisciplinary drug policy program. Before becoming a full-time professor in 2009, he practiced constitutional litigation, specializing in high-impact public interest cases before Mexico's Supreme Court, winning landmark cases on abortion law, same-sex marriage, tobacco control, and antitrust law. He has published work on militarization, history of legal thought, constitutional law, sexual and reproductive rights, drug policy, and tobacco control. Professor Madrazo is currently the Academic Director of Talisis in Monterrey, Mexico, and a member of the board at the Drug Policy Alliance. Please join me in a round of applause as we welcome him to this stage.
Hi, how are you all? Thank you very much for this welcome, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, the invitation. Fernando, I mean, the whole center, but Fernando in particular, I want to thank you for this opportunity. It is something that is very special for me, this event. I was mentioning over lunch, it feels to me like a comeback. Preparing this presentation has triggered a process of actually taking up, for the first time in 4 years almost, a somewhat fresh project of research. For the last 3 years, I've been doing mostly administrative responsibilities, and now I think I may be going back to a more research-oriented focus with projects such as these. So it's important to me in that sense, and I'm going to make two statements that I want to share with you about this project, which is they're contradictory, or they seem contradictory at first. It is a very personal project, and also this is the first time I successfully tried to produce something with a large language model. That is, I use ChatGPT. So it's both personal and deeply impersonal at once. In all fairness, I use ChatGPT mostly for the presentation, but there's something important about using ChatGPT, and this is why I'm telling you the story. So let me go back and tell you why this is very personal. This piece, or this presentation, which is, I think, maybe becoming a book project. I wasn't going to say that, but I just did. Began as a piece that I prepared for CELA, el Seminario en Latinoamérica, Teoría Constitucional y Política, which is a seminar that's held every year with Latin American academics. It's organized by Yale and 11 universities across Spain, Latin America, etc. And I've been going to it for 20 years. And so last year it was in Mexico City. And it was not only in Mexico City, it was in Mexico City right after a major constitutional amendment, or several major constitutional amendments that happened in Mexico in September of 2024, which pretty much overhauled the whole judiciary that had been built for the last 30 years, and also established the militarized public security, which was, something I've been working on or against for many years. And so in that context, I decided that, it felt pretty depressing, and I decided that I wanted to present a piece in which we look back at the 20 years and what I had written over the 20 years of Mexico's democratic transition and how that was being pulled back with this amendment. So I prepared a piece that was mostly based on my old pieces. And I presented it and all went well. I got comments, very nice, very well. Are you depressed? That was the most frequent one, and of course the answer is yes, of course I am somewhat depressed about what's happening with Mexican democratic transition. And that was that. But then when I was invited to make this presentation, I was in the midst of deep institutional transformation regarding artificial intelligence at my day job. And they were pushing us to use artificial intelligence in our everyday activities. And so I decided that I was going to test drive artificial intelligence by doing something I have already done. And so I said, I'm going to write a piece that I've already written. And I decided to pick this piece. And lo and behold, ChatGPT does make a difference, at least it was in my case, because it pulled out an old article. It was actually not my first published article, but the first piece I drafted, which I started writing literally on the night of the election of Vicente Fox in 2000, in the year 2000. In like this momentous event in which for the first time Mexico was actually changing parties, and it was changing to the right, and my commitments were more to the left. And so I decided to start writing about the problems that the rule of law would face in the democratic transition in Mexico. And ChatGPT pulled that paper and had it converse with the other papers that I had written, the first version of the paper, and something came out of that which was not there in the first paper, and which I want to share with you today. And so let me get into it. So, okay, so just full contextual background. I am assuming that people are more or less familiar with what has been happening in Mexico over the last, let's say, 20 years with the war on drugs, and then over the last 8 years with the Morena transitional government, and particularly over the last 2 years with the overhauling of the Supreme Court. But if you guys don't know, you don't need to know all the gory details. I just want to point to this fact. The democratic transition in Mexico was basically built piecemeal over a span of 30 years of minor institutional reforms that aggregated to major constitutional transformations. And those minor reforms were mostly oriented in creating, strengthening checks and balances in our constitutional system so that the judiciary could face a legislature and an executive that had been historically very powerful, and disaggregating key functions and giving them to autonomous constitutional organs. So elections, we don't trust the government with elections, we have an autonomous constitutional organ dealing with elections. Economic competition. We don't really trust the government to do good regulation of economic competition because it has been captured, we bring it out. Access to information, we don't really trust the government, we take that out. So the Mexican transition to democracy was a process of disaggregating key functions so that they would be trustworthy outside of government. Over the last 8 years, that has collapsed. The Morena governments have basically disappeared. Autonomous institutions folded them into government or reduced or constrained their budget or colonized their appointments. That has been major. And the judiciary, the major judicial reform of 1994, which for the first time, I hold, made a serious bet on building a rule of law in Mexico, first time in 200 years, has been pulled back. And now we have a very strange judiciary, which is popularly elected in a very complex process. Nobody understands, least of all the government. So much so that they just decided to postpone the election of a third of the judges a few years. Anyway, this is the context. It's a mess, but it's all you need to know. Democracy was about deconcentrating power. It's now about concentrating power overwhelming. Okay, so that's one point. And the other one is, those of you who are not familiar with López Obrador and the narrative of Morena, they speak of a fourth transformation. And this is going to be important because it ties directly into the narrative of 3 previous transformations of our history. So with that in mind, let us begin. So let me begin by that first article that got pulled by artificial intelligence against my better judgment. And that was the very first piece, which I wrote very much inspired in a book that I had just read called The Reign of Law, written by Professor Paul Kahn. And in that book, he spoke of the birth of, or the origins of the rule of law in the United States. And there he posits that, the political imagination and legal imagination need narratives just as any other imagination. So we need to tell ourselves the story about who we are and where we came from. And in constitutional law, that story in modern democracies, the US being the paradigmatic example of it, harks back to a moment of the eruption of the people, the sovereign people, at the moment of the founding of the political community. So during the American Revolution, the people appear, establish an order, and then recede and leave the order to function. Very much, architecturally speaking, like we imagined God erupting into the world giving 10 commandments and then receding. It is basically the same architecture of the imagination. You have the ultimate authority who is not continuously present. And it can't be continuously present because the order that it establishes depends on that being based on rules. And rules can only be changed by the sovereign. So if the sovereign is present, the rules are malleable. If the sovereign is absent, then the rules are fixed and stable. And so constitution and revolution, Paul Kant posits, are mutually dependent yet mutually exclusive. If you're in the midst of revolution, then you are exercising political action without the constraint of law. By definition, the sovereign will not be constrained by law. If you are in a constitutional regime, then by definition, everybody's subjected to rules. You can't disregard the rules because here's the catch, because he who disregards the rules is not present anymore. So constitution and revolution, law and sovereignty, are mutually dependent yet diachronic in the political imagination. They have to appear at two different times. They can't appear simultaneously at the same time. That's how the origin story of the US democracy is built. The people appeared, and after that there's amendment procedures, and you can reinterpret it different ways, but there hasn't been another constitution, so to speak. So the people play the role of God, the Constitution played the role of the 10th Amendment, the 10 Amendments, the 10 Commandments, and then you have a regime that is set up after that, right? Now, the problem is that in Mexico, that never really happens in the imagination. There is a genealogy, which I will go into, which continuously speaks of the people erupting in ordinary time and changing the rules. And so that didn't really happen, and that has important implications. Now, here's the thing that I want to focus on. This was what I owe ChatGPT, in keeping me honest. So one of the methodological papers written by Paul Kant in a different book called The Cultural Theory of the Law says that what he proposes to do can only work if you suspend the project of legal reform. He wants to do a cultural analysis of law, and he wants to look at law, but he wants to look at law with eyes that are very rare in legal academia. See, lawyers are, and this has been so for the last 1,000 years, since the legal profession emerged in late medieval northern Italy. We are always concerned with moving the rules to what is right, or in having the right interpretation of what the rule is. It's always about correcting the system. And so the mindset of the legal profession is always enmeshed in the project of legal reform. Now, what Paul Kant asks is that to do cultural analysis, that they have to suspend the project of legal reform. Now, when I presented my paper a year ago at CELA, and people asked me if I was depressed, it was mostly because I was basically telling the story of the failure of the democratic transition and the establishment of the rule of law in Mexico, and how that failure had occurred in real time throughout or shared careers in that space. So that idea of failure had embedded in it the idea that there was a correct way to establish the rule of law and the relation between law and sovereignty, and that we had failed in doing so. And that means that I was fully enmeshed in the project of legal reform, and that methodologically I was betraying the premise on which I was trying to build a dialogue. I had to suspend my commitment to the project of legal reform before I could actually see what ChatGPT showed me. And what ChatGPT told me is, maybe this isn't about the failure, but at a recurrent pattern of functioning between sovereignty and law. Maybe this is not, a failure against the idea of against an idealized notion of rule of law, but this is how authority gets organized in Mexico over time. And of course, I don't think I could have come up with that until I had lost hope in the democratic transition. See, as far as I was embedded in trying to make that project of legal reform survive, I was not taking the critical distance needed to see something other than just the failure. And so what I want to do now is to revisit this whole analysis, but suspend the judgment of whether this is a failure or not. I think it is a failure because I am committed to the rule of law. And I think it is a failure because of the type of democracy that I believe we should establish. And as a member of the political community in Mexico, I think it has been a failure. However, let me say this bluntly, throughout my whole career as an academic, I was also involved in trying to make the world better and trying to make, doing a lot of activism. And that personally put me in a position of constantly trying to see how we could move things to where it was right, but not necessarily allowed me to understand how things were actually working. And so now I think we can actually, I feel personally, I can look at what is happening and see what is actually working. And I want to speak to what is actually happening, whether or not we see this as a failure of the rule or not, of law or not, because it is pretty interesting when you look at the dynamic. Let me begin then with a genealogy. So cultural study does two types of things. One is diachronic following of certain concepts, genealogy, and the other is a synchronic analysis of how concepts work together, which is architecture. And so I'm going to go with genealogy and architecture before we continue. So this is genealogy. So why this relationship to law that doesn't really take the law seriously in Mexico? And I've done a lot of historical work, and this is a synthesis of several pieces. And I want to take the work of Luis Villoro of El Proceso Ideológico de la Revolución de Independencia, which is, he's a philosopher studying the origins of the independence movement in Mexico. And so what happened in Mexico? We've always been, I think we have this reputation for not taking law too seriously. And I think that we deserve it. But that wasn't always the case. Turns out that during the colonial period, it seems that what is now Mexico and parts of the US and parts of Central America, et cetera, but throughout the Spanish Empire in general, the American peoples that were governed by the Spanish Empire seem to have been pretty legalistic. So there's a book I recommend, The Enlightenment on Trial. It's a lot about how townships and peoples and individuals went to the courts to fight for their rights and sometimes spent years in litigation, generation after generation. The small towns, they kept going to the authorities and using the law to make claims. There was popular investment in the law. Of course, not everybody, not everywhere, but there was probably more than there is right now. A perspective of seeing the legal authorities and the law as a legitimate way of solving a problem. In 1808, when the French invade the Spanish peninsula and the Spanish kings abdicate, they come into this constitutional crisis, they abdicate in favor of Napoleon's brother. And of course, that's not recognized by different cities and city governments and different authorities in Spain. And there are several revolts all over Spain and in the Americas. Most of the independence movements in the Americas can be traced to what happened in Mexico in to something similar to what happened in Mexico in 1808. So what happened in 1808 is the news came in that the king had been imprisoned and he had abdicated. So what to do next? Now, what the government of Mexico City did is what most governments of major cities throughout the Spanish Empire did, which was say, this is major, but there is precedent and there is doctrine as to how we can deal with this. When the sovereign disappears, sovereignty reverts back to the nation, not the people, the nation. And the nation was thought of as consisting of different corporate groups that formed the nation, whether it be guilds or whether it be the church, etc. It was different corporations were represented differently, but one of the major representations was the government, the city government of Mexico City, el ayuntamiento. That was the representative body of the city that was the head of the king. And so the Mexico City government called on the other city governments throughout the kingdom to send representatives to form a national government to hold the ground until the Spanish king was restored. And they really believed that they were doing this with strong legal foundation. They were simply applying the law in a case that they thought now deserved to be applied. Now, they called on city governments from throughout the country, and while they were gathering, they said, but we'll govern, we have to govern before they get here, it's far away, not good communications. What we will do is we will, on our authority, because the king, the royal authority has disappeared, on our authority, we will appoint the viceroy as viceroy. And so the viceroyalty can continue. But there was another level of government, which is the audiencia, which was So the Mexico City or the city governments were the representatives of those political communities. And the audiencia was the representative of the royal government with the viceroy, right? So here the Mexico City government was appointing the viceroy and skipping the audiencia. Why? Because the audiencia drew legitimacy from a king that was no longer there. For the Mexico City government, the audiencia had no legitimacy. The authority lay with them. For the audiencia, that didn't play out very well. So the audiencia basically carried out a coup d'etat against the viceroy and against the Mexico City government and imprisoned the leadership of the Mexico City government and, most likely murdered one of them while in prison. And this was a major crack for the Creole elites of Mexico because they were being displaced by the Spanish functionaries. Their representative government was being displaced by the Spanish functionaries, and it was being done illegal. So Luis Villoro says this is a crack in the legality and the legitimacy of government. This is where the legitimacy of colonial government breaks. And immediately after that, you start having conspiracies in 1809 in Valladolid, and then eventually in 1810, the conspiracy of Querétaro, which breaks out in the movement of independence. And so Villoro says, so the first thing there is a break in legality. And that does not get translated into a new articulation of what legitimate government is. That gets translated into a spontaneous, let's call it, a spontaneous mass popular movement. The independence movement was mostly a happen. It happened. It wasn't theorized. It wasn't announced. They were actually caught while they were doing the planning, so there was no manifesto that came out that was clear and coherent in any narrative. Basically, they burst out from the town of Dolores, gathered people along the way, went to the cities, ransacked the cities. Eventually, after a few months, they tried to establish a government in Guadalajara. That effort failed because of a military failure of the revolutionary government of independence. And then there was a really long period of instability in which the great task was to establish a coherent command in the independence movement, which is what eventually emerges with Morelos. So what we have in 1808 is a crisis of legality. And so legality seems broken by the Spaniards in 1808. Between 1808 and 1810, there's a lament of the Creoles who want legality to be reestablished. But then when they do make a move, it bursts out as an uprising. And Villoro here, this is the key of what Villoro says. He says, sovereignty in Mexico was action before it was thought. It wasn't thought of as a power. It wasn't thought of as a source of authority. It was exercised in a mass mobilization of ransacking and carnage. And then eventually they started thinking about it and figuring it out. And when they did start thinking about it and figuring it out, by the time they write a constitution in 1814, the constitution says that the people establishes the right of the people, not the nation, the people, to change government at any time they see fit. There is a right to revolution embedded in the Constitution of 1814. And that's kind of weird in a constitution to have a right to revolution as explicitly stated as that. There has been some precedents in France, but it's really radical. And so it's particularly radical that that clause has survived since 1814 all the way into our current constitution. Okay. Now, why, how do we understand that statement that, the people can always change government? It's a little bit different if you make that statement here in Stanford today than if you make it in Apatzingan in 1814 in the middle of an uprising in which literally the people are in arms establishing a government and have been doing so for the last 4 years. And so the idea of the people, the sovereign, being present literally with arms while establishing a government is very real for a first attempt at a constitutional government. 1815, there are several constitutions between 1814, none of them very successful, until the Constitution of 1857, which takes up that clause again, the right to revolution. But the Constitution of 1857 had another peculiarity. And I'll go back to that in the next slide, but I'll touch upon it now. The War of Reforma, the civil war that is known as the War of Reforma in 1857 in Mexico, which is often simplified as a dispute between liberals and conservatives, or liberal federalists and conservative centralists. Regardless of ideology, it was mostly fought between the professional army and the National Guards. Now, the National Guards had been formed a few years earlier as a response to the US invasion in 1846. The Mexican government realized that the Mexican army was no match for the US army. And so they decided to make an attempt at what the French had done during the Revolution, which was a mass enlistment of citizens. Now, they didn't have the capacity to enforce a mass enlistment, so what they did is they offered full citizenship, which was something very difficult to have back in the 19th century, offered full citizenship for anybody who joined the National Guard, even if you didn't have property. You had to have property to have citizenship. And so a lot of people went into the National Guard, and I'll go into reasons why they went. It wasn't only a nationality. We actually did feel threatened by the US, surprisingly enough, and people responded. Of an army, held an army in terms of volume, not really in terms of equipment or tactical capacities, but still, the country mobilized massively. Citizens took up arms, and it was those citizens that had taken up arms and lost the war with the US that later took up arms and won the Civil War against the government and established the Constitution of 1857. So when you say the people can change government in 1857 in the middle of the Civil War, again, it doesn't feel like a theoretical claim. It feels very much like a factual claim. We go back to we go forth to 1920, to 1910, the revolution, or revolution. This is the revolution, Mexican, myth. This is where, history really, Mexico catches up with history, and in the narrative that was transmitted throughout the 20th century in all third-grade textbooks, this is really like the maturing of the Mexican polity in the revolution. But it is the people up in arms. And the Constitution that established in 1917 was literally voted on by representatives who represented the people in arms. You had as many votes in the Constitutional Congress of 1917 in proportion to the number of people you had armed and ready to fight. So again, here it was the people in arms changing the Constitution, establishing government. So we have a consistent genealogy of the people coming in and changing the Constitution every generation practically. But then you have the PRI after the revolutionary period, and that's the institutionalization of the revolution. The hegemonic party ends up calling itself Party of the Institutionalized Revolution. And the narrative behind that is that the people have claimed power through the party and have taken over government. And if that is so, then the people are governing. And so there's a confusion, a conflation between government, party, and people in that narrative. And that is pervasive throughout the 20th century. And that is what was, the context when I wrote that first piece in the year 2000. And then that piece didn't age very well because people would look at me and was like, really? But, I see the rule of law happening in Mexico. Look at the cases the Supreme Court is ruling on. Look at, there's no centralization of power around the president. The presidents are relatively weak. They have to negotiate everything. Really, it didn't look like Mexico was well portrayed in my 2000 piece. But then López Obrador comes in with a narrative that directly reignites this. The fourth transformation. So this is the first transformation, independence. This is the second transformation, reform. This is the fourth transformation, revolution. First transformation, second liberal reform, third transformation, the revolution of 1910, and the government of Morena is supposed to be the fourth transformation. They all have names, but not the fourth one, because it doesn't really matter. At this point, the narrative has a cadence of its own. This is the fourth one. It aligns itself with the other three. What happens with the other three? And I'm going to go into that. The people come in and correct the course of history. So one step back. So actually, that the people come in and correct the course of history is that one. But so second point here. Who is a legitimate government in Mexico? Is it a government that follows the laws? Is it that what is legitimacy built on following the rules? Not really. Because of the narratives that we've established regarding our identity, authority is not necessarily with those who follow the rules or who got established through a rule-based system on position of authority. Mexico has told itself a story of victimhood. So the narrative, the national narrative is that the Aztecs were the victims of the Spanish. And then 300 years later, there's this reivindication and we kick out the Spanish. But then every foreign power and every colonial power is searching after us. And, we weren't that paranoid. Independence was recognized in 1821. By 1828, the Spanish were already sending an army to invade Mexico again. By 1835, the French were sending an army. By 1835, also, I mean, it wasn't a foreign army, but the Texans were claiming independence, and they looked pretty foreign. I mean, when you look at the demographics of the year of independence, there were something like 2,500 people inhabiting Texas, and then by the time Texas claims independence, 10 years later, there's 45,000 people. Now, my guess is that those 2,500, mostly Hispanic settlers, did not reproduce en masse to reach 40,000 by the following decade. So that army looked, pretty foreign and pretty American too. And by 1947, there's the invasion, which is pretty traumatic, and I'll go in, actually, let me go into that. So here's another controversial proposal. The foundational moment of Mexican identity, not of Mexican attempt at collective government, but of Mexican identity, is not independence. It is actually the US invasion. Because it gives Mexicans that are very diverse linguistically, culturally, economically, very dispersed, and very uncommunicated, a reason to coalesce. And not only a reason, actually the means to coalesce. Mexico deployed something around 40,000 soldiers during that war. Soldiers from the southern coast of Guerrero ended up fighting and defending Mexico City, or going up to San Luis Potosí, and then ended up in Coahuila defending the Batalla de la Angostura. We always say that Mexico got integrated during the revolution, because during the revolution there was this mass movement of troops across the country, and people actually moved across the country, and that is very much true. But before the revolution, there was the American invasion of 1848. And that did mobilize a lot of the population. It did move a lot of the population, but in the imagination, for the first time, there was a call for collective action that was massive in propaganda of the government, and it focused on three things. We need to safeguard the honor of your parents, of your fathers specifically, who gave you independence. You need to safeguard the honor of the altars, which are going to be desecrated by the Protestant barbarians who are coming from the north. And you have to protect your women, because they are coming to rape your women. And those were the three major messaging during the war to mobilize the population. And a lot of it actually felt real and existential. Independence was thought to be lost. I mean, President Polk actually fired the negotiator because he didn't go for the full annexation of Mexico. It was a real threat. And the desecration of the altars was also a real threat. It did happen several times. And, just to make the point symbolically, the treaty was signed in the shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico. That was pretty humiliating. You didn't have to have her as a witness for, giving over half the territory. But also the rape was felt as true. And here, unfortunately, it wasn't just propaganda. Particularly the Texas Rangers, who had been fighting a war with the Comanche, who used the technique of rape as part of the war, their war of attrition, deployed it pretty significantly and publicly in the Mexican war. And so there's this whole notion of being violated by the country. And the idea of rape is constant throughout the narrative. One of the last things that Mexico City does to prepare itself, the army doesn't tell the population that it's leaving, but it does make sure that the nuns can leave for nunneries, lest they be raped when the American soldiers come in. So this whole imagination of coming in, raping, desecrating, violating is, I think, the foundational moment of our national identity in many ways. And of course, we project it back. The conquest is seen also very much as a figure of the rape, with Malinche and the Indian women being put in that place. And then the constant invasions, and of course, every time Trump threatens with sending a missile to Badiraguato or something, it feels pretty real now, feels flattened now. So there's a lot of that identity that comes with being conquered, with being harmed, with being evicted. So who is thought of as legitimate? He, and mostly it's he, today it's she, but he or she who can protect us from such harms. The other grand victimization narrative, which is also pretty much true, as is true in most post-colonial countries, is that the elites are actually cahoots with the foreigners and exploit the people. And that actually does have some historic grounding on it also. But those two things make the idea of who's going to protect us from the the exploitation from the elites or the exploitation from the world powers. And that is who's legitimate. And so we have a very keen sense of vulnerability and a very, very, very strong penchant for recognizing authority on those who we believe will kind of protect us in that vulnerability. Legitimacy tied to effectiveness. Legality, that's nice to have. But what I really need is not to be raped, not to be exploited, not to be dismembered territoriality, right? So what happens? What happens is that if the sovereign is present, and moreover, the sovereign is the government, then why should the government be constrained by norms if the norms were put in there by the sovereign? I mean, it sounds a bit absurd and childish, but that's the architecture of the narrative. The people provide the constitution, from the constitution stem the laws, from the laws stem the decisions of the authority, and that's how you establish the rule of law, right? But if the people are ever present, and if the government claims to represent or to be the people, and then why would we limit the government if it's the people? And if they're violating a law, well, that's their will, and the law is nothing but the will of the people, so, they can do that. And two phrases that I think are very important to keep in mind, two phrases from López Obrador, or former president. One is when he established his pact with the military, he consistently began referring to the military as the people in uniform. It is not the military, it is the people in uniform. That is transferring his massive legitimacy with a historic landslide electoral win within 2 months before even taking office, and started speaking of the military as the people in uniform. And then another phrase that points to this. Who remembers here? No me vengan con que la ley es la ley.
Yeah.
Don't tell me that the law is the law. So those phrases you listen to, they said, that's nonsensical. How can you have a president say that and people not immediately be up in arms saying, get out? Well, this is why. Because the law is not the source of legitimacy. The law is a subproduct of the people, and the man is claiming, and seems to be credibly enough accepted by most people, to be representing the people directly. So good luck with the law and the rule of law when you have the sovereign people as incarnate in the leadership of the party governing. Now, what happens here? The sovereign is ever present, the law is also present, and they're both coexisting. And sometimes the law is used, but sometimes discretion is used. And it's pretty acceptable to move between the law and discretion. The man we always speak of as the founder of the Mexican state, and, or great creed of the rule of law, Benito Juárez, who was first president of the Supreme Court and is always, dressed very austerely like a lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. Benito Juárez has this great phrase, which, we love quoting his phrases, but we don't realize how terrible sometimes they are. Para mis amigos, gracia y justicia. Para mis enemigos, la ley a secas. So here, he could be saying, for friends, I can, be equity, equity in this case, and, strict rule of law in this other case. And we're like, oh yeah, the law to my enemies. Well, yeah, dude, but if you control the law and you can tailor the law to be whatever you want the law to be vis-a-vis your enemies, knowing that your friends will not have the law applied, then the law to my enemies seems like a threat. When today we're discussing a constitutional amendment in which they're considering, in the context of the New World Order, that the judiciary will be able to annul elections in cases of foreign interference. What we are applying, what we're expanding is precisely that. I'm designing the law. I'm appointing the judges. Guess which elections are going to be annulled for foreign interference? But it will be legal. So here's the thing. We have a culture of disregarding the law until we change the law to fit our practices. And the case study I want to mention here, how am I doing? Is militarizations. So what happened? This is like the archetype of what this can portray. Militarization was built upon existential fear that the government, in this case it was the PAN government of Felipe Calderón, openly propaganda and made propaganda to make the organized criminal organizations an existential threat to Mexico back in 2006 when they weren't really an existential threat to the country. But that allowed for a series of legal changes first, then legal practices that were contrary to the legal changes and legal practices contrary to the Constitution to become naturalized and stabilized. For instance, and I won't go into the technicality, simply have the military do ordinary police work. The Constitution, since 1857, expressly, as I said, the National Guard defeated the professional military, and so they put in the Constitution, the military, in times of peace, basically cannot go outside their bases to go to the bathroom. You know, they have to stay within their bases. 1857. The practice, however, started relaxing in the 1980s with natural disasters. And building on that practice of mobilizing the military for natural disasters, we very naturally felt that it was okay for President Calderón to deploy the military to do security crisis in Tamaulipas and Michoacán. And then why not expand it throughout the country? And then a series of legal changes, which would make it a bit harder to control the military and control the attorney generals. And, you know, I have a whole piece on this, but you have piecemeal legal changes and practices. So, okay, we can't appoint a military man to a civilian position in the police, fine. The general will ask for a license from the military and he will now be the chief of security, right? So all these little practices that eventually made it very natural for the military to be present everywhere. And even though there were something like 5 constitutional amendments that were defeated to change the Constitution to allow for militarization of public security, it kept happening. And eventually, when it became naturalized, it just was very natural to reform the Constitution and amend it in 1824. So one of the key features of the constitutional regime in Mexico, which was civilian government with very restricted military because of our history of military coups in the 19th century, first fell out of use until it was a footnote in a battery of constitutional amendments that the military were allowed to do public security. So this is what I call the constitutional costs of the war on drugs. And that is, before the existential threat of security, we allow for practices and laws to curtail rights and to deactivate checks and balances and to alter the actual functioning of the constitutional system. But then we changed the law. So now the practice that was unconstitutional for 20 years of deploying the military for public security is now constitutional. The Constitution has now absorbed the inconstitutionality of the practice, which was legitimated because it protected us and it was ordered by the person seen as the legitimate representative of the people. Now, let me go back to, do I have another one? Oh, this is the last one. Okay, let me go back. Because I do want questions and answers. Where I want to go with this now, I'm not sure. But there's a concept that I want to pick up, and that's the original dichotomy that Paul Kahn argued for between sovereignty and law, between revolution and constitution, I think maps wonderfully well to what happens in the United States, the political imagination of the United States. And I spent 25 years trying to have a dialogue with the person I see as my mentor, but failing because what I wanted to do is I wanted to trace the story of where it would end up either as a failure or as a success in emulating the US. Now, I want to change the whole perspective. And I think I have to go to something that goes deeper in the epistemological debates. I want to explore this tension, not as a tension between two concepts which exclude each other, which have to be diachronical, but to understand how it is that they are synchronical, how it is that they happen simultaneously, that we have spaces where the rule of law is applied, sometimes is applied precisely with a political benefit of using it instrumentally, for my friends, grace, for my enemies, the law. But then there's other spaces where we blatantly disregard the law because it's not seen as a legitimate constraint on the authority and political authority. Okay? How do we understand this? We can understand it as a failure, yes. But if we are to take up the project of suspending legal reform to understand legal culture and political culture, then I must withdraw from looking at it as a failure and I need something different because Mexico does not fit this dichotomy between sovereignty and legality. And what I hope to explore, there's a concept that I'm looking into from actually Aztec philosophy, a book by James Maffei. He says that in the metaphysics of the pre-Hispanic cultures, there's this notion that I find very interesting, which is inamic partners. The word inamic comes from Nahuatl, we don't understand now, but the inamic partners are two values or two entities that are in tension and that seek to dominate each other, but don't seek to eliminate each other. They need the other's presence to exist and to make sense. So, in Aztec philosophy, it's, dryness and wetness, and, of course, gender, masculine and feminine, and, war and peace, night and day, those are inamic partners. What if we take that idea that, we don't have to separate them as diachronically existing, sovereignty and law, but we can understand them in this tension in which they're not trying to eliminate each other. See, the problem with the diachronic thinking is that if revolution appears, the law has to disappear. And if the law establishes, then sovereignty can't be anywhere near. But that isn't happening in Mexico, and it's not working for us to think that way. Is there some notion in which you can have a tension in which these two things dominate each other, alternatively, without suppressing each other so they at some point can coexist? And there, I think, lies a question for understanding our dynamics. And that requires that we think consistently of the rule of law, not as something that is, but as something that is becoming. And that is a major epistemic shift. So if we understand this as dynamic, not as a static system, it is not revolution and then constitution. It is not, and then once constitution is established, it's there for good. And when revolution is, nothing else will be there. How can we understand these two as coexisting in changing equilibria throughout the times? We had a hell of a lot more rule of law over the last 30 years. We're going to have a lot less the next 30 years. But are we going to have no law whatsoever? You can't say that. Does the law cease to be law because the president says, don't tell me that the law is the law in a major political issue? Not quite. The law doesn't completely disappear. We need different epistemic categories to understand this meshing that is so complex, and that I think allows us to better understand the reality of the rule of law and politics in Mexico. Instead of looking only as a failure, we can actually start understanding how it works. And whether it's a failure or not will be more personal value, but we can have a common understanding of how it fails or how it succeeds. I look at it as a failure right now because I was so committed to the rule of law for the last 25 years. But in many ways, when you look at the history of it, this ambiguity allows for a lot of, for example, social change that wouldn't have happened earlier, or for deactivating violent process of rupture. In many ways, however catastrophic I think that the last 8 years have been for the Mexican government, I think we were close to an uprising and to major social disruption. And this breaking of laws systematically has allowed a détente. What function does it serve? I'm not happy with it at all, but I do want to understand how it is that we can remain committed to ideas that seem so exclusionary, like having a law. It's not just I think it's not just for pretending that we're following the rule of law. I do think that there are still mechanisms within the law that make sense to a lot of people, but they don't make sense for other political processes. And spontaneously, we seem to be shifting between those in a very haphazard way because we don't understand what is going on. I want to understand what is going on in the tension between sovereignty and law so we can manage it a little bit better. Our problem today is that we don't understand it and we don't manage it, and it is becoming a catastrophe because we are having both the worst parts of the rule of law in terms of arbitrariness, of formality, of oppression, and the worst parts of the absence of the rule of law, which is full discretion, politicization, and instability in knowing where you stand. At this point, we have the worst of both worlds, and I hope that we can understand better the dynamics and maybe have better use of those two schizophrenic personalities that we have regarding the rule of law in Mexico. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
This framing on the part of AMLO and Morena, the military as the people in arms. What do you think explains that choice? Is it just about the political economy of Mexico? Because I could see an angle where one could, frame the military as being inextricably linked to an outside power, say the United States, which is, trained Mexican army in counterinsurgency that's had disastrous consequences for Mexicans. Like what?
So just to make the precision, are you asking why do I think this is the way AMLO traces it, or why do I think AMLO went to bed with the military? The phrasing, is it the phrasing that intrigues you, like the people in uniform, or is it just, looking at them and saying?
I think it's like the latter. I think it's
okay, looking at them and saying
what explains that?
His alliance.
Yeah.
I'm unsure.
Yeah.
It was very sudden. He had basically campaigned on a platform of peace, and then he had a meeting with the Secretary of Defense in Campo Militar Número Uno, which is where the Secretary of Defense. This important was the president-elect going into the military compound and coming out and speaking for the first time as the army is the people in uniform. I think there was a packed hammer out there. I'm not sure what the nature of it is. People always ask me. I always say I do think something happened there, and I think it could be either I do think the military is capable of making credible threats as to the governability of the country, or maybe intelligence regarding political allies or his children or something. So it could have been a personal coercion there. It could have been also a strategic pact. By using the military, one of the things López Obrador clearly wanted to do was to bypass the bureaucracy. One of the first things he did was to dismantle the professional public service. This is a way of ensuring that you don't have to use the public bureaucracy in order to do certain things like major infrastructure projects. So this allowed him a lot of the country of transparency, opacity in major government contracts throughout his government. Substituting the civilian bureaucracies is more efficient. Military obey better, and they can not disclose information with more legitimacy. Also, they could have convinced him that the country was ungovernable without them, but that one I'm a bit taking it with a grain of salt.
Thanks, Alejandro, for the wonderful talk. I was thinking about the structural factors that are playing this ambiguity. And I'm thinking, is there without resolving drug trafficking problem, the cartels, is it even possible to think that it will turn black? Because it seems like it's a massive influence in leaving that state, like that ambiguous state forever, because they benefit. Like the organized crime will always benefit that there's an ambiguity between, like the an actual state of rule of law or an actual sovereign power, right? So I'm thinking like maybe this is a very strong force that even if a government really try to implement the rule of law, they're fighting against this very big influence that right now is, if I was on their side, I'm thinking, well, this is the best scenario for us. Like this ambiguity, because we don't let it sit into anything, like crystallize into anything. I don't know. And the other structural thing is just like, I don't think it will settle down into anything until we have resolved economic inequality, right? So those two factors for me are perhaps playing a role in this ambiguity. I don't think I cannot picture a country where we go one way or the other if we haven't solved those two issues.
So let me speak up inequality. I fully agree with you. I think that the core of anything that you can say about Mexico is the deep inequalities upon which it is built, historically, politically, economically, etc. So I fully agree there. That's an issue that we're not going to solve. And precisely because we're not going to solve it, and that's, I think, the point. This is not going to decant itself into rule of law or, just popular action directly. Just like in the US, which has probably the strongest rule of law tradition, at least in this hemisphere. Now that Trump is there, it's pretty evident that the rule of law is somewhat shaky here in the US also in different aspects. But again, my whole point is, I think we need to cease to wait for this to settle. It's not dichotomic. It is dynamic, the word that I was bringing. It's always going to be in tension, and it's always going to be shifting. The question is, if we understand those shifts, then we can, steer it more into the rule of law the more we can. So precisely because it's never going to be Kant, is that I think we have to have an epistemological shift and to start thinking about something that will not settle, that will be constantly being unsettled and constantly in tension and constantly shifting in its balance. As to the organized crime, I think this ambiguity has been there for a long time before the organized crime became an economic factor or a territorial power. So I don't think that it actually feeds in there. I actually think that at high level, like most other entrepreneurs, I think drug traffickers would like a better rule of law because rules make for clear business and you know where to establish yourself, including those that prohibit your product because that's what actually makes your market, the black market. So I don't think that the instability in the rule of law is particularly, I mean, I think it's very important at the local level for impunity in homicide, et cetera, but that had been not there long before organized crime settled in. So I think organized crime can thrive in this and other ambiances. I don't think it has vested interests in undermining the rule of law.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering, is this dichotomy between sort of popular will and law, or however we want to think about the relationship between these two, is the dynamic of a willingness to disregard law in favor of, let's say, efficient popular goods, provision of popular goods or something like that. Is that track also to sort of lower level municipalities and neighborhoods and things like that? Or is there more of a sense of concern over the violation of laws and rules the closer or more proximate you get to people's schools and houses and lives? And I guess what I'm getting at by asking this is this a relationship? Is this about a relationship to law, or is this about a relationship just to the federal state?
The state.
And it's kind of like, well, they kind of provide some goods, but like the real business of politics is like the things that would get me really animated if people were breaking the rules. So, are in like my neighborhood association, my municipality, where there seems to be a closer relationship between popular will and law, the rules that are made. So I don't know.
It's a hell of a question. It's a hell of a question. Thank you very much, because it's a very good question. Let me not answer it, but to react a little bit. So first of all, I think that to answer the question, we would probably need to do a hell of a lot of ethnographic field work, and answer it will probably differ enormously across Mexico, and you could probably group them in either geographical regions or small towns versus larger cities, etc. So it's an empirical question with a very difficult answer with a lot of field work, but it's a hell of a question. Now, intuitively, I would say probably attachment to the local. And this is really a good question, and I'm now thinking of bringing in a novel from the 19th century to this because it speaks to this. The formal law is not seen as something that is produced locally, but as brought from outside. So most of the law in Mexico that is relevant today, and discussions go through the federal, we have federal system, but when you look at what the federal Congress can legislate on, the list just has grown since 1917. The federal government has, I would argue that Mexico today is a centralist republic, not a federalist republic, because of so much has gone to the federal level. So I think that the law is seen mostly as top-down and mostly federal, but even in the local instances, it's seen as top-down and foreign. I think that most, especially communities that have important self-identity, like small villages, et cetera, have persistently felt themselves to be outside the law. I mean, they felt they were with the law. These are the guys that were litigating before the king. They were very litigious and they were very legalistic, and the revolution, they were, finding their claims dating back to the 16th century, etc. These are the core of the rule of law culture, if you wish. But I think that it's within the rule of law in terms of this is how we dialogue with the world outside, but how we dialogue with the world inside is not, it's not governed through law, it's governed through customs. So at the village level, I think that legitimacy is not even that close to law itself, but that's speculation. Mm-hmm. It's a question.
Yeah. Well, it's such an honor having you here, especially because also I see former colleagues from the same institution, and also that is one of the reasons why I decided to study public policy. And I don't know what to feel about, like, I don't know if to feel sad, anger, hopeless, or there are a lot of feelings like right now for me. But the question is like, what do we do as citizens? I mean, although I live here, I'm always thinking about my country because there's like my friend, family, and I will speak for everyone. Like Mexico is what matters because what it seems is that although there is a lot of violence and we see everything on the news, it seems that people that vote, they don't get to care about that because if they don't care enough, I will hope to see some effect on the last campaign or on the last electoral results. But that doesn't seem to be true. It seems that for people, doesn't matter how bad the country can be seen as long as they are like receiving money or as long as, and I'm not nothing against that. The problem is my worst fear is that what will happen the day when we run out of money. And the thing is that we are super dependent of what the US is doing in terms of like the global economy. So basically the question is, what do we do specifically? And what is your prediction for the upcoming years based on what you discussed here and from all the comments that you are like gathering?
Hold on. Okay, so this is the question I never wished I was asked, but I'm always asked. What do you do with all those feelings? Go through them. I think it's important to go through them, to allow yourself to be angry, to be frustrated, to be hopeless, to be sad, to be all of that. Because I do think that it's a very intense moment in time to be in the world and certainly to be Mexican. And we need to acknowledge those feelings because they are crossing us in what we do and how we understand the world. Second, I'm a lot happier since I've lost hope. Personally speaking, I'm a lot happier since I lost hope because I'm no longer engaged in what to do. Now, I don't want to remain this way at all, and I certainly don't want to encourage you to remain this way. But personally, what I have done over the last few years is take a major step back and withdraw and observe because I clearly wasn't understanding what was happening. You see, and part of the way you phrase your question reminds me of me. Because you say, you know, no matter what happens, the electoral results are not going to reflect the mess that we're in. And that's exactly what I thought for many years. You know, when the war on drugs was launched, I said, this is a catastrophe. I could see this was not going to be a good public policy. And then it turned out it wasn't, and then it wasn't. And then I started actually studying it and dedicating time to it because, you know, people are not noticing this is such a, you know, counterproductive strategy. And you know, then I spent 15 years trying to fight militarization and the changes. And there's a question here that I want to pick up because it speaks up to that. So it's always what to do. And I did everything that I felt could be done. And I think I did a pretty good job in, you know, what was within my reach. It is when I realized, or when I felt that I couldn't do anything immediately, that what I could best do was to withdraw so that people around me wouldn't get hurt, et cetera, that I had this distance. And with this distance, what I am now doing is trying to understand better the dynamics. Because the logic that I was in, this is what you remind me, is precisely that, you know, okay, these idiots launched a war that was unnecessary. They're undermining the security, they're undermining state police, et cetera. What we need is the other party to win the election. And then the other party did, and they didn't change anything. And so we need the other party to win the election. And then the other party did, and that didn't. Things got worse in terms of security and militarization, et cetera. So maybe it's not about the parties, and maybe it's not about who governs. Maybe it's about how we relate to those who govern and how we relate to the law. And that is not something we're going to be able to solve probably within our lifetimes. But that's what I'm going to dedicate myself to try to understand now, because I'm older and tired, and I got very tired during those 15 years of activism. But what I would say is, if I were your age, I would hold the ground on key issues. Documenting, speaking, understanding, for when there is time to actually have more impactful action. On those of us who are a bit older, I think that we are in a very good moment to actually reflect on what we spent our lives doing the last 15 to 20 years. Because it turns out, you know, we didn't, as we say in Mexico, no entienden que no entienden. we weren't quite understanding. It wasn't about party change, and it necessarily isn't about establishing the rule of law in the sense that we usually think of. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's not about federal decisions, but about moving to local and understanding the dynamics in the local. The crisis is so deep that we better take our time to think about it, because we're not going to have many chances to actually deploy action. So I don't know. My answer to you is I don't know. I'm observing and trying to understand at this point. When I was finishing my graduate students, I saw the world wide open in doing judicial activism, because we had a Supreme Court and we had a judiciary and we had the Institute for Access to Information. And I spent my life, those two institutions these were the gates that are also open. They're not there anymore. I don't know what there is. We need to start to see what opportunities are, because those opportunities have been shut down. If there are no more questions, there's one here I'd like to it says, to what extent do you see a connection between the curtailment of fundamental rights? Or do we have time, or should I? Yeah. If you want, I'll read these if there's anyone. So to what extent do you see a connection between the curtailment of fundamental rights as a part of the constitutional cost of the war on drugs and democratic backsliding? Particularly, I am interested to know to what extent do you see that the restriction or the reduction of fundamental rights across the board or of certain people affects their democratic values and current democratic backsliding the Americas faces? Long question. But basically, what I think they're asking is, are fundamental rights and the curtailment of fundamental rights instrumental in the backsliding of democracy? And the answer is yes. And it is yes, because that is where we first start accepting less protection, when we start accepting curtailment. So if you look at the war on drugs in Mexico, most of the legal changes that culminated with the amendment of the Constitution with full militarization in 2024 began as expansion of exceptions to due process rights of criminals in organized crime. A very targeted regime to a very specific type of criminal under very specific circumstances. That's how it was sold. Then the list of crimes that could be subjected to that started growing, and the definition of what it was to be participating in organized crime started growing. And that grew so much that by 2021, academics exercising a budget that they had because of a legal mandate were accused of organized crime because they were using funds to criticize the government. That's how the reduction of fundamental rights grew from 2006, when we said, okay, let's accept some due process exceptions to organized criminals because they're so dangerous. Let's allow them to be communicated for 48 hours. Or let's allow them to be detained for 72 hours without formal charges, but only in case of organized crime. But then the definitions start moving. And then when you least expect it, 2021, 15 years later, not that much, you have 41 academics who were carrying out a legal obligation under a federal legal mandate using funds received from the government, everything perfectly documented. They had to stand trial for 2 years for organized crime, and they were potentially subjected to all of these exceptions in which they could have been, isolated from the world for 72 hours with all the implications that has the torture in Mexico, etc. That's how those reduction of fundamental rights sneak into major changes. So now you have academia against the wall, and you have, gets pretty scary. And I'm using that example because it literally hit close home. I mean, my boss, the guy that inspired me to set up the drug policy program, was accused of organized crime under these laws. How are conversations regarding constitutional costs taking place outside of academia, such as in policy media, and how have they shifted post-2024? I don't think we're having that much conversations about constitutional costs. I think that it's not articulated in terms of a constitutional regime change. But for the first time, I see a liberal elite alarmed by the constitutional changes. And I have to say that many of the constitutional changes that I consider constitutional costs happened before the López Obrador administration. Probably the worst happened during the López Obrador administration, but this is shared by all three parties that have governed Mexico this century. And I do think that there's more of the elite media and academia who are now realizing the gravity of these small constitutional changes, who were being far more lax when the center or right-wing governments were in place. That's a difference I see in the discussion. It did alarm a little bit academia once it's coming from because they're also more blatant about it, right? I mean, what president says, don't tell me that the law is the law, right? Ours. I don't know if there's other questions, or you want to read these questions, or yeah.
Mexico's not that different from many other countries, right? We all have friends from other nationalities and they all have their own demons and their own issues to address. In some ways, after connecting with many of these friends, I realized that, I mean, what we have is very, very similar. The issues that we deal with in terms of government, in terms of sometimes security. I understand the drug problem is a little bit different, but in some ways, I think what we face is a very human challenge, right? How to organize ourselves and how to find the right system to guarantee justice to the entire society. So can you make some, I don't know, statements in terms of how what we see or what you analyze here applies to other places? I mean, we're seeing that with Trump here. We're seeing that with Putin in Russia, right? He's remained in power for almost 30 years. He's like a god there, pretty much. All dictators have this playbook, right? When you turn a democracy into a dictatorship. I mean, AMLO, would have done that had it not been for like the claims of the revolution, right? That there's no re-election after Porfirio Diaz. So what can you speak to in regards to like statements?
So first of all, and this is something that happens to me very often. I'm so focused in Mexico that people say, "Oh, that sounds very much like Venezuela." But I'm like, sure, by all means, let's look into it. I have no clue because I'm ignorant deeply in that sense. I did, however, in the constitutional costs piece, try to make a comparative study, and we found precisely the same pattern in Colombia, and we actually found some of that pattern in the U.S., but we couldn't prove it in the U.S. law professor to do a piece, so we published a comparative piece, Mexico, Colombia. But now some of the NGOs are starting to take up that piece, for example, drug policy changes that undermine constitutional rights in the U.S. So I think there's a lot that can be extrapolated. And I also think that it is part of your nature in academia to try to find general statements. We still have this notion of science as being, the ambition of universality. But I would say this, I think that it is important to understand how we give meaning to these situations. And how we give meaning to the situations is very different. The narrative part, the symbolic part, is probably what interests me most, because that's how we make sense of the world. And here Mexico does have peculiarities in its commitment to the idea of revolution as ever present. And that discourse is, I think, pretty idiosyncratic, at least from what I've seen around. I mean, I see a lot of undermining of the rule of law in the US, but there's no claiming that there's an undermining of the rule of law because, I am sovereignty incarnate, right? So to me, it's more about, or what's interesting for me, rather than the quantifiable structural similarities, is the symbolic meaningfulness of how we come to understand ourselves. And in Mexico, this is how I think we can understand ourselves. I don't know elsewhere, the US I'm a bit more familiar with, but I think you need really an internal perspective of what provides meaning for the community. Now, having said that, I think it is a problem of these types of communities, because these types of communities are way too big for actual democratic processes to take place that are integrative. Modern democracy, ancient democracy was based on the city. Modern democracy was designed thinking about a political entity the size of Rhode Island or Vermont. It wasn't designed to rule continental power. And so there is a problem in scale that I think we're all going to be facing, in which the law is increasingly something that is far away and not in the community, because power is increasingly far away and not in the community. And maybe 100 years from now, we're going to be talking about a regime in which big corporations with IT are the big identity. Are you Grok, or are you Claude, or are you GP, ChatGPT, whatever? That may be the case, and the scale will be much fatter. And whatever we're thinking about now, we'll have to reimagine completely. Where we're at with the nation state, but the nation state of this scale still happening, I'm just trying to figure out how we understand ourselves to try to provide collective cues and a collective language to eventually build something better. But we're not there yet.
I have a question. I asked the democratic lifeline question.
Oh.
And I was thinking, and sort of reminded of the question that you made. So this is kind of a half-baked question,
It's a
But-
half-baked piece.
So what's the piece in Constitution on kind of the cost of the war on drugs and how basically we see that the implementations that have been made or changes that have been made in order to allow for the militarization and the war on drugs, there is a sense that like the laws become, you start moving the law, like excluding from almost human rights, right? Like who has those human rights? Like it seems that we start like saying, oh, this, 24 horas illegal, right? And then you can go even further. So what I'm wondering is, and then you talk about this like synergy almost between the law and sovereignty, and that we're kind of in a state where it's like the worst that it has been. So I'm wondering whether there is like also fundamental within this, there's a fundamental kind of almost like othering, or like when you have both the worst, then it comes to a moment where as this comes up, it has to bring the humanization of people.
Dehumanization or dehumanization?
Dehumanization.
Dehumanization, yes,
Like-
that's exactly what we're doing. And it begins, in the case of Mexico, with the criminal. There's I don't know if I sent you this for reading Criminal Anatomy, the Political Imagination. Anyway, it's one of the pieces that feeds this work. And it's a comparison between the discourse regarding the criminal that was deployed during the Calderon administration and the discourse regarding authority and the narcocorridos and how they look at each other. And I was trying to take it. And it's interesting because I wrote that piece twice. You're going to think I did write things twice, but it's the only two pieces I thought of writing twice. And this was because a research assistant convinced me that I hadn't gone deep enough in the deep well to find the narcocorridos I needed to find. So the first time I did this, I said, okay, so there's a politicization in calling the criminal the enemy. Because, again, sovereignty and law. The enemy is an entity that occupies in the space of sovereignty in the imagination. Okay? An enemy is a foreigner who can potentially threaten the political community existentially. And so when I see an enemy, the correct response is to defend the community existentially and destroy the enemy. The enemy is not part of the community. The enemy is not protected by the community or by the level of the community. The enemy is fair game. And the enemy is a threat to the community. Of course, there's foreigners, and they're not necessarily enemies, but they're always potentially becoming enemies, right? Now, within the political community, you have also people who, misbehave. Not everybody are friends, but they're not supposed to be pushed out of the community, at least not today. There was ostracism back in Greece, but today you're not supposed to be pushed out of the community for misbehaving. If you're a criminal, the law punishes you, but the law also protects you. Because that's its claim to asking you to behave. If it doesn't protect you, then why would you behave according to the law? The enemy, one, is not protected by law. He has no connection to law. Why would the law protect you? The criminal is protected by law. And yet, during the war on drugs, where we made the enemy, the criminal, we made the criminal an enemy, an existential threat. And we formally reduced some rights, and that has to do with dehumanizing the criminal. But rhetorically, we've also just symbolically, so the phrase that I like worse, it was Calderon's inauguration of the public park in Ciudad Juárez. I believe it was 2010, 2011. But he literally said, and this part, this is rescuing public spaces, which is the core of the policy, because this part is for citizens, not for criminals. It's like, dude, citizens are criminals. No, it's criminals are citizens. Sorry, criminals are citizens too. Criminals are citizens too. But in the imagination, in the discourse, they're no longer citizens, even if legally they are. But that then allows you to treat them as if they were not. And there's signs of torture. They're evident and blatant signs of torture. He fell down the stairs. Right? We can play stupid to that because he's already been dehumanized. That expands. When López Obrador came in, not only were the criminals stopped being like a punching bag of a threat, the conservatives became a threat to the people. Fifís became a threat to the people. There's a dehumanization that is according to social class. And if you criticize, then you're part of the opposition. And the opposition is fifi, and the opposition is upper class. The opposition is part of the elite that exploits the people in that narrative. Okay? So that is a very dangerous thing to do, to take somebody from within the community and treat them as if they were from without the community, at least part of it. It dehumanizes them, and then leads to, that's how concentration camps began in Germany. It's a dehumanization of one group, and then the other group, and then another group, and then you build on it. And the more enemies, the more the enemy is inside, the more threatening, and the more it justifies action. And so the more leeway we have on that. And so it is a very dangerous, because then, who's going to be dehumanized? Well, it's going to be, peasants eventually, right? That's what happened during the revolution. Morelos, if you were a peasant in Morelos during the revolution, you literally, that's where concentration camps began. I mean, the Germans learned it from the British in South Africa, the British learned it from the Spanish in Cuba, and we also learned it from the Spanish in Cuba. We had concentration camps in Morelos for the Zapatista townships. Forced concentration of our citizens. So it begins. It is very dangerous, I think. On that happy note, are there any questions?
I have a question. I'm really interested in the way that you use, or like, how did you like influence yourself to think about the inadequate of sovereignty and rule of law? Because Matthew talks about the dynamic pairs as being like powered by by thought, and like thought's ultimate goal is to be in balance. So I don't really know how a neoliberal or post-neoliberal nation state can be in balance.
Me neither, but I want to borrow Matthew's framework and start working on it. I haven't really fleshed it out. Now, how it happened by accident, as most of the things that I like most in my academic career have happened by accident. So I'll tell you the story. A very good friend gifted me the book because I wanted to be a historian once upon a time, and I love discussion of metaphysics. So I was really reading it for leisure while I was reading this. Now I've learned in my career to, when you connect to things that are accidentally connected, at least go down the rabbit hole a little while to see what happens. That's literally how my doctoral dissertation happened. I happened to be doing a paper on 16th century Spanish theologians while reading a court opinion on a case that I had litigated, before. And I saw the parallels in the structure of argumentation. I said, I have to be. And 4 years later, that was my doctoral dissertation. I'm not sure that's going to happen here, but it happened haphazardly. And so it happened by accident that it was Matthew that I read, but I was already asking myself a question of what is the correct epistemological framework, and maybe what I would do is to look into an ontological framework that is sufficient. And it was in talking to people about ontological frameworks that this friend said, I'm going to give this here. It was more of an accident, but I did have a question of ontological, the ontological framework for understanding this instability.
So then, like, how did you make the considerations for this dynamic pairing? Like, what makes them have like the tension?
Well, the tension is embedded in Paul Kant's observation that once sovereignty appears, in the presence of sovereignty, law must cease, right? So you can't have them both be present at the same time because they should explode, but we have them present here. So the dichotomy that Kant asks for cannot happen, right? If they're enmeshed, and I'm observing that they're enmeshed, then I cannot correctly conceive of them as mutually exclusive because I'm looking at a country and a world in which they are enmeshed and in tension. And here's the second part. The tension is not stable. The tension, and here's the delta, once balanced, but once balanced not a given moment and a stable balance, but the balance is over time. It balances with the fluctuation of the pendulum, moving in one extreme of the pair to the other extreme of the pair. The balance is in the whole process, not in the specific moment. And when I saw, and I said, I made the joke that my first piece, when the first piece came up, I was like, whoa, this piece that had aged horribly actually now looks wonderful because it spoke to the revolution undermining law. And that dwindled for the next 20 years. The law became much more important in governing Mexican collective identity from 2000 on, from 1994 on, but particularly from 2000, I'd say. And that was receding, and then the discourse of revolution came back with a vengeance with the Cuatro T and with López Obrador. And it moved the pendulum in the other direction, but it hasn't disappeared. It's still there and it's still resisting. And the judicial reform is actually pushing back and trying to gain some time. So what I'm seeing is a pendular motion in which they're never eliminated. They're never eliminated. And it hit me, this is what dynamic pairs do. They never eliminate each other. They're dependent on each other. So you can't have a constitution without revolution because you need the will of the people to be manifested, right? But you can't have so you can't have it without sovereignty, but you can't have it with sovereignty because then it undermines law. So sovereignty is both a condition of the rule of law and the annihilation of the rule of law is present. It has to be supposed by the rule of law, but it can't be present in the rule of law. So maybe there's something to dynamic pairings that allows us to understand this tension and this pendular motion better. And let me go deeper. I think the question is about dynamic or static understanding of the world. We have a static understanding of the world, and so we want categories. Is this a rule of law or is this revolution? And I think that we need an ontological understanding that is not dichotomic and that is not static, that is about dynamism and about changes, because that's what we're seeing. I now no longer want to move everything into the rule of law because I think that's an impossibility. I think we're going to have to live in the oscillation between something closer to the ideal or further from the ideal, and that happens to be my ideal, but that isn't necessarily the ideal of everyone, and that's part of why we're going to be moving back and forth. Because when the rule of law is actually really well established in a political community that's this large, it probably perpetrates part of the inequalities that is built on, and somebody in there is going to see it as illegitimate. And that somebody is part of the dynamic pairing. And it's, thank you. Wow, so you read in Matthew.
Thank you very much to Professor Madrazo. Please let us give him another final round of applause. Thank you all for joining and attending in person, and those streaming lively through YouTube. This concludes the last class seminar of the spring quarter. And thank you for joining the previous ones, and hope to see you in the future ones in the next quarter. And have a great summer.
Yeah.